This won't be business as usual for anyone at Thermo Fisher Scientific Company. Workers here distribute medical and lab supplies. Today, though, they'll be answering detectives' questions.
When our patrol deputies get there, they discover that there is a female face down on the floor in an upstairs area. Her hands are bound behind her back, and there is a bag over her head. She was beat in her face and her head. The bag that was over her head was covered in blood. She had a cut on the bridge of the nose where the cartilage meets the bone. It looked like a fighter's nose who's been punched and there's the split. This was something more than just one person being killed by another person. There was a lot of anger and a lot of rage put into this death.
The police immediately put Thermo Fisher Scientific on lockdown.
Rarely do you see a murderer stick around the crime scene. We have a controlled building that has limited access. We just said, there's a good chance our person is here.
The deceased is identified as 42-year-old HR manager Michelle Mockbee. She'd worked for the company for 16 years. Investigators start by looking for witnesses and establishing a timeline. Co-workers say Michelle came in early that morning, 6 a.m., instead of her usual 8 o'clock arrival.
She came in early because she wanted to get her payroll finished and sent off to corporate.
Detectives put another marker on the timeline. The man who called 911, Ed Yuska, says he got to work around 6:45 and went straight to his office. The first sign of trouble came 15 minutes later, when a maintenance man asked about a stain on the hallway carpet.
He goes, Ed, what's all this mess on the floor? Well, that's what I look, and I go, that's blood.
They then called up the janitor to see if that stain had been there when he had cleaned the office areas that morning.
He said, that stain was not there this morning when I was up here. So they started to investigate further, and they noticed that there was a long trail of blood down the hallway, leading out into this area that we call the mezzanine.
And I turned the corner, and I see she's laying face down, and they had something wrapped around her, and her hands were behind her back.
And they immediately called 911. It appeared to crime scene investigators that Michelle was originally assaulted in the actual office space itself.
Then she was dragged down the hallway to the mezzanine area,
where she was ultimately assaulted again, and that secondary assault is what led to her death. Officers were never able to locate any item that they believed would be the weapon that had been used to kill Michelle Mockbee. Whoever did this obviously knew their way around the building and had a lot of time to clean up the scene. Very quickly, it became apparent that there were 13 employees who were there at the time this took place who were potentially suspects.
Detectives interview each one. They also ask for DNA samples and examine each for blood on their shoes and hands. Then, they look at everyone's backstory.
Was there any rumors or any like office flings? Did anybody have any show any sign of that they were interested in Michelle?
No, not at all. She just, like I said, she had her life was her 2 daughters.
A doting mother, a devoted wife, Michelle Mockbee didn't seem to have an enemy in the world. In 1996, Michelle was hired at Thermo Fisher Scientific. There she met the man who would become her husband, shipping supervisor Dan Mockbee.
They got married in March of 2001. They were that couple that you look at and you're like, gosh, I wish I could be like that. They would always be joking around, always saying I love you before they hung up the phone. They just seemed to like always be happy together.
90 minutes after Michelle's body was found, her husband shows up at Thermo Fisher Scientific.
He was getting phone calls from his subordinates that they were not being allowed into the building, that there was some sort of police activity. He was trying to call his wife, and he was starting to get worried. Why is Michelle not answering my calls? And I was the person who told him that Michelle had been murdered. He leaned back in his seat, threw his hands in his face. He didn't want to believe it. And at that point, I had to just sit and let him process the information. It was really tough to watch.
When a married woman is murdered, the husband always needs to answer questions.
I wanted to know what had happened between he and Michelle the night before. I wanted to know, why weren't you at work? I needed to know everything about what occurred the night prior. He was cleared by the interviews, cleared by his actions, and allowing us access to literally everything in his life. At that point, we no longer looked at Dan Mockbee as our suspect.
When investigators searched Michelle's office looking for clues, they find someone had tried to get in.
Investigators located fresh pry marks on the door of Michelle Mockbee's office, which was one of the only locked doors in the entire facility.
They were fairly small marks that looked as if it would potentially be a screwdriver.
The question became, is this something that was related to the assault on Michelle, or is this something that had happened and was completely isolated?
As the investigation continues, new information surfaces that could narrow down the list of suspects even further.
After interviewing employees, detectives went back and, as a routine part of the process, ran criminal histories on each of the employees.
11 of the 13 have clean records. 2 don't.
The only people of the 13 employees who had any criminal history whatsoever were Doug Tungate and David Dooley. Doug Tungate had a prior receiving stolen property conviction. He had only been at Thermo Fisher Scientific as a temporary employee for a matter of months. Doug indicated that he was hoping to be hired on as a full-time employee there. However, he was waiting for his background check.
Because Doug has this criminal history, he may not receive clearance to work in this building. We have to look at that as, is this a potential reason why Doug is not a full-time member now? And Michelle would be one of the people involved in that. Does he have an axe to grind with Michelle?
The other employee with a criminal record is the janitor, David Dooley.
He has some felony convictions, possession of handgun by a convicted felon.
David had actually served time in the penitentiary on at least 2 other occasions for burglary and theft-related offenses.
When they talked to Dooley the day of the murder, there was something about him that didn't feel right.
Well, one of the things that was noticed by the investigators was that David was very clean. This is a large warehouse that ships medical supplies, so there are a lot of boxes there. Thermo Fisher Scientific is a very dirty and dusty place.
By his own account, he had spent 2.5 hours cleaning in that building before investigators even arrived. And so he wasn't sweaty, he wasn't dirty, he didn't have a hair out of place. It just seemed unusual to them.
When I left Thermo Fisher on that first day, my shoes were dirty, my clothes were dirty. This is not the kind of place you're gonna leave clean.
Just about that time, detectives get a hold of a new piece of evidence.
We were actually able to get a small snippet of surveillance video from the company that shares the same building. On that video is a large break for us, and that is seeing at 6:31 a red truck leaving the parking lot. And then at 7:05, the red truck returns.
None of the 13 suspects admitted they'd left work, only to come back to the plant 30 minutes later.
The question then became, whose truck was that, and why did they leave?
And we discover that the red truck belongs to David Dooley. On the first day of the investigation, David Dooley did not say that he left. He said he came and worked, and then we showed up, and that was it.
David Dooley was the janitor. David's cart equated to a rolling crime scene cleanup cart because he had all of the items available to him that most criminals have to go out and get in order to clean up a scene, including bleach.
You can actually see the big blood spot outside of the women's restroom. There were streaks and marks where someone was trying to clean it. That was very easy to understand that he could have done that.
Bit by bit, investigators are building a case against Dooley. But there's one crucial element missing: motive.
The best belief that we had was that Michelle Mockbee arrived unexpected at a time much earlier than usual.
He was breaking into the office. Michelle Mockbee walks up, surprises him.
And he cold-cocked her and knocked her out, and then started panicking.
He says, uh-oh, I'm in big trouble now. And he decides he's gonna finish the job right then and there.
4 months after Michelle Mockbee's death, David Dooley is charged with murder, tampering with evidence, and kidnapping for restraining and moving Michelle during the crime.
From the beginning, we confronted the fact that there really was no smoking gun in this case.
This case is gonna take some circumstantial evidence, and juries these days, they wanna have hard evidence.
We played all of his statements one right after the other so that they could hear for themselves the glaring inconsistencies between the stories.
The videotape showing David leaving the building and then going into the testimony of where he was at, why he went, what he did.
David is clocking himself in as soon as he gets there, and he's clocking his wife, Janet Dooley, in when she's not even there.
We had surveillance, and only 2 times in the month of May that you can see Janet Dooley on the property. But they charged the company hourly overtime for her every day of the month of May. They were getting paid thousands of dollars each month above what their contract called for.
The prosecutors finally have a motive.
The prosecutors really painted the picture that the possible motive was David Dooley tampering with his time cards.
It provided the context for understanding why David would want to be breaking into Michelle's office and the motive behind killing her, getting rid of her, so that his fraud wouldn't be discovered.
The jury gets the case and comes back with a verdict in 16 hours. First, the judge announces the verdict on the kidnapping charge: not guilty. Then he announces the verdict on the tampering with evidence and murder charges.
The judge revealed he was found guilty. And it was just an immediate sigh of relief. It was just a huge weight lifted off of our shoulders, knowing, okay, this is behind us, you know?
The judge sentences Dooley to life in prison plus 5 years. The judge hands Dooley 38 years for murder and 5 more years for tampering with evidence.